lead Republicans to their first majority in the House in 4 decades. And he rose to the Speaker's chair. He resigned his congressional seat in 1999. Before entering politics, he was a professor of history. And during his political career, he professed to be a great admirer of President Ronald Reagan. And I mention this because in a message observing National Newspaper Week in 1983, President Reagan said, quote, "Since the founding of this nation, freedom of the press has been a fundamental tenet of American life." Speaker Gingrich raised eyebrows this week when he made a somewhat different pronouncement. He called for the elimination of the White House press corps because he said, quote, quoting, "They are, quote, enemies of President Trump." And he went on to say that journalists have earned the label enemy of the people. Mr. Speaker, we appreciate you coming here to the National Press Club to discuss your views on our industry and your new book, Trump versus China. I think a lot of you have the book. So welcome. So I guess my first question is, why are you here of all places?
Well, look, first of all, I was invited. I believe in freedom of the press. I don't happen to think that the White House press corps, in the way it has evolved, is particularly useful. I think it's too cloistered, it's too precious, you have a handful of people who become overly important. If you go back and read, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first press briefing in 1933, it is off the record, in a private room. If anybody in the room leaks anything that is not approved, they're never invited back.
And do you think that's a good, healthy way for the press to behave in a democracy?
Well, I think Franklin Roosevelt was reasonably successful, and it was a reasonably free society. And my point is, the country doesn't exist for the purpose of the White House press corps. And presidents, I once asked David Gergen what lessons he'd learned, because he had served in many different presidents in both parties. And he said he thought in retrospect that the biggest single lesson was that the press's deadline wasn't the president's deadline, and that presidents ought to actually focus on their job and what they're doing, and then let the press cover them, but they shouldn't focus on the press. And so I would say that, for example, I think you could design an entirely different model where local reporters could ask questions of the president. You could literally have virtual press conferences with people coming in from 30 different cities.
I think this White House started to do that via video conference, where they allowed reporters around the country to do that.
And I think that would be a very useful alternative. But I really do think having very, very sophisticated, very smart, very energetic people who spend most of their days sitting and waiting is a really bad model, and leads people, I think, to have an adversarial behavior.
Okay. Not to be adversarial. However, you did go on to say that we, journalists, including myself and probably some other people in the room, have earned the name enemy of the people.
I think there's no question, when you look at some of the news media, which has on occasion been clearly false, that's not exactly serving the purpose of a free society.
Okay. Clearly false.
Clearly false.
In the sense of the...
In the sense of the New York Times in the 1930s having a reporter in Moscow who deliberately lied about the existence of the famines in order to prop up Stalin's image.
Can you mention anything from this century?
From this century? Sure. The New York Times almost every other day.
I'm just asking for something a little more specific.
No, so, this president, for some reason, and again, Reagan had a fair amount of this. There's a certain mythology here. Reagan was in constant fighting with the news media, and the news media said and did things to Nancy Reagan that were very, very unfortunate and inappropriate. But the fact is, the news media in America is very far to the left compared to the base of the American people, and certainly very far to the left compared to Trump. And I think election night was so traumatizing that a substantial number of reporters have never recovered.
So I understand your point of view. Do you have any statistics or proof showing the news media is so far to the left compared to the public?
Oh, I think there have been poll after poll going all the way back to 1972 of how reporters vote. They consistently vote to the left of the country.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I think you can just take Gallup and other data. I don't even think that's a serious question.
No, it's quite serious. I think it's quite serious. I haven't seen a poll, a public opinion poll that asks people what they do for a living and who they voted for.
No, but there have been many polls, many studies of reporters where they single out reporters, go to reporters and say, who did you vote for? Mm-hmm. Consistently, they vote 85, 90% on the left.
Okay. So let's move on to your book.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
And by the way, people who are, I think, genuinely respected as serious students have written about this and have argued that it isn't just, Michael Barone, for example, wrote a number of years ago, that in every Western industrial democracy, the news media is on the left.
So what is that? Is it conservative people don't want to go into journalism?
Oh, I think it's partially just the nature of the culture of the newsrooms. It's like modern academic culture. I mean, if you want to make sure you don't get tenure, go in and say, I'm for Trump. And you'll be guaranteed not to get tenure.
But Trump's been the president only for 3 years.
Well, in the 80s, go in and say, I'm for Reagan. It's a very similar pattern. Okay. And actually, there's a great study, one of the greatest students of American political science wrote a piece in 1953, and this was a guy who was a moderate Democrat, who said he was at this cocktail party on election night in '52, and not a single person, this was at Columbia, not a single person at the cocktail party had voted for Eisenhower. And he said, so the country just voted 55% for Eisenhower, and there's not a single person in this room who's in the 55%.
I'm just trying to figure out which journalists weren't working on election night, but who was at the cocktail party? Let's move on.
No, it was the night after the election.
Oh, okay.
Because Eisenhower had won the night before.
Okay. So we have Trump versus China.
Yes.
Tell us why you wrote this book.
Partially I wrote it because I was wrong. I mean, I had a model in my head of China and a model of its probable evolution, and I misinterpreted Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour, where he called for open markets, and thought it was the first step towards a more open society. That was in 1992. And it was clear that that isn't what was happening. And I began to realize that, in fact, the China that actually exists is remarkably different from the China we project. So I'll give you a simple example. If we could get the news media and the administration to refer to Xi Jinping as the Secretary General of the Communist Party, which has 90 million members compared to 63 million votes for Trump, to then refer to him as the Chairman of the Military Commission, which supervises the People's Liberation Army, which is the army of the party, not the army. It's not a government army. It's a party army. And, by the way, his third and least important job is President of the People's Republic. Now, they have done a very good job of always referring to him as president because they're trying to normalize him in our minds. But, in fact, what you have in Beijing is a Leninist totalitarian system of centralized control that routinely uses police state behaviors in order to coerce and intimidate its own population. I did a podcast the other day with a gentleman who teaches at Hunter College in New York, who's Chinese, who was disappeared. That is, disappearance occurs when you're walking down the street, the police pick you up, don't tell your family, don't tell your lawyer, and eventually you may show back up. The Pandit Lama, I think, has been disappeared now for 25 years. Recently, then by the way, this guy was released, and the routine pattern is you get to be released when you're willing to make a video saying you were guilty. And therefore, it's totally appropriate to disappear you because, after all, you'd earned it. Recently, they disappeared the highest paid actress in the world. And for 6 months, nobody knew where she was. And then she made a video saying that she had done certain things that were inappropriate, and she fully understood why this was the right thing. But the real purpose of disappearing her was to say to everybody else in China, if we can do that to her, imagine what we can do to you.
So your argument, and this was U.S. foreign policy's general belief for decades, that by engaging countries like China and doing trade with them and working with them, they would, by nature, through capitalism, turn into democracy.
That's right. And it was wrong. And to me, and I say this in the book, I say, look, I was one of them. I thought we ought to put them in the World Trade Organization because they'd learned to be in a rules-based organization. I thought they were gradually going to open up. It was all a lie. And it's not. This is not to say that these are evil people sitting around in the afternoon thinking this stuff up. These are people who are Chinese. They represent 5,000 years of tradition. Until 1800, they were the richest, most powerful, and most prestigious country in the world. They went through what they call the century of humiliation. And in their mind, they're back. And being back means that the rest of us should understand that if the NBA tweets wrong, it should apologize or be punished. And the fact that it happens to be an American company is irrelevant, because the Chinese have the right to punish anyone they want anywhere on the planet.
Now, I read what you said about the NBA in your Fox News column this morning.
Yes.
And I just want to find out if you draw any distinction between that and the NFL players who were protesting and our president tried to punish them.
Well, our president said it was the wrong thing to do. I think that's actually a very good example. Mm-hmm. Take a look at Donald Trump saying, in effect, I really think this is a bad idea. I'm really opposed to it. I really think the owners shouldn't let them do it. And the Chinese
said they should fire them.
Right.
Yeah.
If they did it, the owners should have control of the team they pay for.
Good.
Right. That's what he said. Okay. Didn't enforce. Didn't have police power. What the Chinese government said to the NBA was, we're cutting off 17% of your income unless you kowtow. Just understand. There's a huge difference between Donald Trump expressing a strong opinion and Xi Jinping using the full power of the government to blackmail an American company, I think.
Okay. So what is the solution? Are you suggesting that the trade sanctions right now are the solution to this problem?
I think that we are faced with an opponent so powerful and so intelligent that, and I say it in here, I think they're the greatest threat to us since the British Empire in the 1770s, much greater than Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. And I think that it's going to, first of all, require a national conversation. I'm going to require us, it's part of why I wrote the book, is to say, this is a topic if you don't want your grandchildren speaking Chinese and obeying Beijing, then this is a topic we'd better have a national dialogue about. I also have a chapter in the book that says a lot of our problems aren't China's fault. So, I mean, it's not China's fault that we have 6 schools in Baltimore in which not a single student was able to pass either the math or the writing exam. Not a single student in 6 schools. Now, we're not going to compete with China without very deep and very bold overhaul of our education system, because we're producing people who can't compete. And we have to be honest about it. That's an example. But we need a national conversation, and then, frankly, we need a wrenching change in our systems. We're not prepared today. If you look at the rise of Huawei and the development of 5G as an internet-based system, we have no American company that's competitive, not a single one. In 1929, 3 Army Air Corps majors on their own decided they had to compete with Germany and Latin America, and they founded Pan American Airways. And the U.S. government then made sure that Pan American Airways succeeded. And it was very important in terms of making sure the Germans didn't dominate Latin America. And we're going to have to think through an entire range of capabilities if we are going to survive faced with a system this powerful and this intelligent. I mean, I have great respect for it. I am not in any way suggesting that these people are either stupid or incapable of being serious competitors. I have great respect for their capabilities and their seriousness.
I'm going to open up the floor very soon, so if you have questions, start signaling on that issue. So right now, there's a big hand-wringing, wrenching conversation in the United States going on about Facebook, which has proposed a cryptocurrency platform. WeChat in China has a cryptocurrency platform. It is huge compared to Facebook, and has, just by nature of it being in China, millions, hundreds of millions more potential customers.
Right. That's part of the reality of the world we're entering. I mean, I don't frankly get exercised about cryptocurrencies. I think they raise very interesting questions because you begin to have, for the last couple hundred years, currency has been essentially a national monopoly around the world. But if you go back and look at Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, the last section of the book, which I frankly never quite could get through because it's so opaque. I mean, I read all the parts that relate to economics, but the last section is on Scottish currency and Scottish banking, and it was not a topic I could ever get very excited by. But prior to the rise of the modern nation state, many different places created currency. So I mean, I actually, Clifton and I think own 3 units of Bitcoin, and I gave 1 each to our 2 grandchildren.
But a huge amount of the U.S. projected power across the world is because we have what is considered the reserve currency and the banking system that everyone depends on.
Sure. And it'll be interesting to watch and see whether or not, in fact, you can develop a genuinely autonomous currency that maintains its value and that is not susceptible to states taking it over. I mean, in the end, power ultimately is the ability to physically occupy. So, it's conceivable, and you're seeing this with the internet now. People thought, and so if you go back to the 1990s, people thought, oh, the internet's always going to be open. Well, no, the internet, in fact, is very closed in a lot of countries because sovereign powers have the ability to occupy with armies, and they have the ability to shoot you, and they have an ability to sort of say, you really don't want to do this. And so people find themselves limited, even though in theory the internet was supposed to be open. The reality of national power has intervened.
So you talk about the need for a national conversation, the need to talk about the fact that China is a threat. I mean, a conversation is one thing. Do you have any idea where that conversation should lead? I mean, what?
Well, I mean, I hope it leads to a desire by the American people that we remain independent and sovereign, and that we maintain our freedoms, and that we do what is necessary to counter the Chinese capabilities and to offer the world an alternative. I had an Australian diplomat say to me when I was doing research on the book that there are a lot more people on the planet who'd like to join the American club than want to join the Chinese club. Mm-hmm. But we need to make it possible to join the American club. And I think that's we did this after World War II. If you look at the period from 1946 to 1950, we're wrestling with all these questions. Are the Soviets really a threat? I mean, we had a former vice president run on a third party in 1948 on the grounds that they weren't a threat. We were guilty of starting the Cold War, and that we ought to basically stand down. And so there was a really big, deep national argument about whether or not we had to respond to the Soviet Union, and if we're going to respond, how should we respond? And I think that we're going to go through the same cycle here because, and the NBA is a good example. There are lots of Americans who aren't going to read this book, and they're not going to worry about, the sophisticated news media. But if ESPN is reporting that the NBA is being blackmailed by China, it reaches a whole tranche of people who would not normally have thought about it. And I think I'm confident that the Chinese will gradually force us into this conversation. And I have enormous faith in the American people over time. I think on any given day, we may not be all that clever, but as a nation, we're remarkably effective over time.
So You keep mentioning the American people, which I think is a very important group, but what about our allies in Western Europe, our other democratic allies around the world? How important it is to have this conversation on a global level?
I think it's important to have it everywhere. And I think part of it gets caused by the Chinese as they go into countries in places like Africa, where they initially offer really good deals, and then it turns out that the loan rates are usurious, that the bridges are going to actually be built by Chinese workers who they import, and that the production is often pretty shoddy. So I think you're actually finding a certain amount of buyer's remorse. But look, I mean, my wife is the ambassador of the Vatican. We currently live in Rome. I spend about 2/3 of my time there.
And we are all jealous of you for that.
You know, it should be. Yeah, it's an amazingly fun place. But when I'm there, you know, all of a sudden Xi Jinping comes to Rome, and they sign an agreement to run the largest port in Italy, which is Genoa, and they sign an agreement to run the port in Trieste, which is the entry point for Austria and South Germany. Well, if that had happened in the Cold War with the Russians, we would have just gone bananas. And we are just totally unprepared today to think about. There are 46 Chinese port projects in Africa, 46. And we're totally unprepared, and your point's exactly right. This has to be a worldwide competition, and it has to involve an ability to reach out. And frankly, the truth is, we have been pretty good at it. I mean, we ran a huge worldwide coalition that contained the Soviets. I just came back from a trip to Japan, where I was meeting with Japanese and Korean officials, and there's a huge. I mean, you know, they look at China and they decide they love us. You know, because we're further away, we're not a threat. So I think the potential is there. The Australians, the more they've dealt with the Chinese, the more they like us. The Vietnamese are really hostile to the Chinese. One Vietnamese said to a friend of mine, you know, you've been having problems for a decade. We've been fighting them for 1,000 years. I mean, so it's interesting. In fact, when I was a freshman, in 1979, I went to a breakfast meeting with the Chinese ambassador. I thought this was surreal. I go to a breakfast meeting with the Chinese ambassador who lectures us on not having been tough enough with the North Vietnamese. And I'm sitting there thinking, I can't quite believe I'm in this meeting. But they were fighting a war. I mean, they fought a very real war in '79 and had thousands of casualties on both sides.
Okay, I would like to open it up to questions. I think I've seen several hands over here. And sorry, the microphone is traveling around. I don't have full control of it, but I will. Kevin. Oh, gentlemen.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, thank you for being with us. In the realm of warfare, there is what's known as kinetic warfare, pulling triggers and bombs bursting. And there's another paradigm that has to do with non-kinetic warfare. The question I pose is, China at war with us?
Well, I mean, the Chinese are certainly would describe it as being in competition. They wouldn't say necessarily war. And I really think it's very important for anybody who would understand this to read Sun Tzu rather than Clausewitz, because Sun Tzu was written about 500 years before Christ and is actually written for politicians, for kings. It's not a book on strategy for generals and admirals. It's a book on how to use generals and admirals. And essentially it relies on bribery, deception, spies, setting up games in a way that the other side, Sun Tzu writes at one point, the greatest of all generals win bloodless victories. So I look at the South China Sea campaign, where the Chinese have now issued a map saying that literally the entire South China Sea is Chinese sovereign territory. It's about half the size of China itself, and have now started building islands and are gradually, methodically, calmly creating an environment where facts on the ground will make it impossible to compete with them. And they're doing it very slowly, very pleasantly. In any reasonable historic model, it's an act of war. And the South China Sea, by the way, has 1/3 of all the commercial shipping in the world. This is a really very important area. And they're doing it in a very nice, pleasant way. And they you know, and they've now invented, and I write about this in the book, they've now invented a fishing fleet which is actually militia. They're subsidized. They don't actually fish very much, but they're available so that if they have to crowd out the Filipinos or the Vietnamese or the Americans, they can bring hundreds of fishing boats to bear.
So where's the line between competitor, adversary, and enemy?
Well, it's a continuum, I think. They will. It's a little different than the Soviets in that Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin really were world revolutionaries. I mean, although Stalin believed in revolution in one country to consolidate it for the purpose of later on having revolution everywhere, but they actually were, in their own minds, at war with Western capitalist society. I don't think the Chinese, in their own minds right now, are at war with us. I think that they think of themselves as being in a very intense competition with us, one they think they're going to win, and preparing that if they have to, they could go to war with us. But since they think they will win the competition without war, they have no interest in getting there.
Kevin.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to have you comment on Hong Kong and what kind of message that sends to people in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world, the way that Chinese are dealing with Hong Kong.
Well, you know, that's a very good example, though, where they are treading a line very carefully. If they had the same mood they had at Tiananmen Square, they would have already sent the army in and crushed the resistance, which they could do. But the first thing to remember about Hong Kong is it's not completely Chinese. There are a very substantial number of Vietnamese, so 80,000 Americans, a significant number of Filipinos, and among the Chinese, there are a large number who are 3, 4, 5 generations in Hong Kong who don't actually think of themselves as mainland Chinese. So the potential resistance movement in Hong Kong is much larger than it was in Beijing. I think that what Xi Jinping has been weighing, and he gave a very tough statement in Bhutan last week when he was on a state visit, and he said, was he in Nepal? I thought he was in Bhutan.
Bhutan, they don't have diplomatic relations.
Okay, then he was in Nepal. Yeah. I stand corrected. Now I'm going to have to go back and check because I don't know why I would have substituted Bhutan. But he said, basically, we will crush the bones and smash the bodies of anyone who thinks that they can disrupt our territorial integrity. Well, I mean, a lot of you think Trump speaks pretty harshly. I think smash the bones and crush the bodies is certainly in a Trumpian level of, you know, communicating clearly. But they haven't done it yet, and I think they're trying to outlast the demonstrators, because I think they know that the diplomatic and psychological hit they would take if they tried to truly repress Hong Kong, and the very real danger that it would lead to guerrilla warfare, that you would suddenly have a substantial number of people, and big cities are really hard. You know, if you go back and look at places like Stalingrad, I mean, the idea that you're going to occupy Hong Kong against the will of the Hong Kong population, that's a very daunting project.
Right here.
My name is René Pfister. I'm working for a German news magazine, Der Spiegel. I have two questions, if I may. My first question is, you said a lot of countries want to be in the American club regarding China, and I agree, the Europeans want. Do you think it's a good idea alienating the Europeans by threatening to impose tariffs, or in fact impose tariffs on the European countries, when you want to have them at your side in the fight against China? And the second, a little bit more general question. There was a big debate, as you are a veteran of the Republican Party, there was a big debate after the Syrian decision of President Trump, if he abandoned partners, allies. Do you think there is a point when the Republican Party will break with Donald Trump because they think it's no longer the foreign policy they stand for? Thank you.
Well, I think in the specific case of Syria, they did. I mean, I don't think there's any question that people like the Senate Majority Leader communicated publicly and explicitly that he disagreed. And I think the party at large, this was partly caused, frankly, by the way they handled it. You know, major leaders don't like to wake up in the morning and be told something happened last night without consultation. Now, it's very common, and the greatest novel ever written about the U.S. Senate, a book by Drury called Advise and Consent, opens with that kind of event. So it's not uncommon, but it always part of our constitutional tension. And Trump dramatically increased the hostility by the way he handled it. Whether he was right or wrong, he handled it in a way that maximized people being mad at him. I don't think they're going to break with him in any strategic sense, but I actually thought they did the right thing. I mean, I think it's very helpful in our constitutional system to occasionally tell a president that you've gone too far and you got to slow down and think. And no president likes it. I used to ride on Air Force One on rare occasion because I was a very junior member, but I'd ride with Reagan, and we'd leave Andrews and he'd come back to chat with us. And every single time he would say, I tried to convince the pilot to go over the Capitol and bomb it, but they wouldn't do it. And I would think to myself, I'm your ally. I'm a member of the what are you doing? But it's a psychology of being president of the United States that all of these little pygmies, it's a lot like Lilliput. I mean, you know, they think of themselves as Gulliver, and they have these little pigeons, and so that's what. The other part, I think I disagree with your premise. I mean, the European Union can't fine Google $5 billion and then issue the order they issued in the last few days on Facebook and declare that it's an extraterritorial instruction to be applied worldwide and not think we're going to retaliate. I mean, I'm a PhD in European history. As a child, I lived in France and Germany during the Cold War. I did my dissertation in Brussels. We're currently living in Rome. I love Europe. But the Europeans have this knack of thinking that everything should be a one-way street. And I'll give you the example of NATO funding. I was an advisor to Bush and Rumsfeld when they were trying to get NATO up to 2%. And, you know, the richest, you represent the richest economy in Europe. And I think it's 1.2% of the GDP to defend itself? Huh?
I think 1.3.
1.3, okay. I lost my head. You know, and I think Trump's attitude was, I think I'll just yell at you guys for a while. And some countries have responded. But I don't think as a country which has since 1945 been the primary protector of the planet in terms of stopping hostilities, that it's wrong for us, given the percent we spend, to say to our richest allies, gee, maybe you should be able to help defend yourself. I don't think of that as hostility. I think it's an honest, straightforward relationship.
Here.
Right here.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. I work for a private Chinese media, and I have 2 questions. One, back in June, I asked the President Trump how he views China, and I gave him 3 options. 1, strategic partner. 2, competitor. 3, enemy. Guess which one he picked?
Competitor.
No, he said strategic partner.
Huh?
He said strategic partner.
Partner.
Yeah. Should I take his words seriously?
I think that's what he would like. I mean, I think Trump's whole personality as a real estate guy is to always try to find a way to work with the other person. I mean, that's why you get this weird stuff with Putin. I mean, I think he really wishes he could go around the planet and somehow schmooze everybody, and then everybody would like each other. But if you watch our behavior, we are certainly not treating China as though it's a partner.
No. So that's why my second question, do you think the root for this confrontational relationship right now is because of the different political systems? And is a quote war that you or many China hawks wants to say that's what's happening? And do you really think that's beneficial to people in China, in the U.S., and in the world?
I'm not sure what you mean by beneficial to people in China.
And what do you mean? It's like everyone if you can exclude China, you can say, is it beneficial to the people in the U.S. or people in the world? Do you really want to see like two, the two biggest powerful countries in the world that are being, confrontational and like what's happening during the Cold War?
Well, I mean, I guess the question I would ask is somewhere between being very aggressive in the South China Sea, just to take that example, I went to, when I was working on the book, I saw a senior Chinese diplomat, and I said, I really want to get your version, your explanation of why you have over 1 million people in concentration camps in Western China. With a straight face, I mean, a brilliant performance. He looked at me and said, you shouldn't think of them as concentration camps. You should think of them as boarding schools, because we're trying to teach the Uyghurs to be Chinese. Now, a guy who can say that with a straight face is stunningly dangerous. So I look at Tibet, I look at the Falun Gong. I mean, how can a breathing society be a threat to the dictatorship? And yet you talk to people who are Falun Gong, they'll tell you. They get locked up, they get killed. They claim some of them actually are killed for their organs, for organ transplants, but they certainly are outlawed, without getting into the more grotesque parts of it. So I think that what you have is legitimately, authentically, one of the two largest countries in the world, since India now is about equally large and will presently be somewhat larger, with a culture of being dominant that goes back about 5,000 years, and with a system of totalitarian Leninism that is guaranteed to be in permanent conflict with freedom, because it's the nature of a Leninist system, and it's why all of this stuff's, why are they scared by Winnie the Pooh? I mean, you show me a country that will outlaw Winnie the Pooh, I'll show you a country that I think has a variety of strange things going on. And they outlawed Winnie the Pooh because somebody said he looked a lot like Xi Jinping. That is weird.
He sounds like Alan Greenspan.
Winnie the Pooh does or Xi Jinping does?
No, Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, but we can move on.
No, this is such a great discussion. Thank you for being here, sir. Sorry, it's me.
There you are. I couldn't see you. I had this I thought it was like one of those movies. I had this disembodied, I say Winnie the Pooh in this disembodied voice.
I know, exactly. I wanted to circle back to the discussion about China and Africa.
Yes.
And your thoughts about Trump's relationship with Africa and his strategy for investment and trade to counter or compete with China's pending dominance, or if already dominance in China?
Yeah, I think our policy to Africa has consistently been inadequate in scale and in some ways has been wrong in structure. I helped pass the Africa Free Trade Bill back in the 90s. I have been talking with the Army's African Command about better ways to be engaged. Callista has been very involved as the ambassador with particularly nuns. I mean, the number of religious orders that are in Africa is amazing, and the courage of people in places like South Sudan and the Central African Republic, where they literally risk their lives every day to run schools and hospitals and what have you. I think that we should, and in fact, I think my next major book, which will probably take 3 or 4 years to write, will be on Africa. It's something that I've been talking about with Kyron Skinner. Africa is the one part of the world that's going to be growing in population. All the other parts of the world are either going to be stagnant or declining, including Asia, which seems to always surprise people. Nigeria, by the end of the century, may have more people than Western Europe. And we have no, this is partly Trump, but it's the administrations for the last 3 or 4 presidents. The two places we neglect at enormous peril to ourselves are Mexico, which is fighting a civil war, and sub-Saharan Africa, where we should have much more attention being paid by AID and by state and by others. Now, we are frankly, I mean, people often forget this, we are the most generous benefactors on the planet. We feed more people than any other country. We provide more help to hospitals, et cetera, than any other country. But we don't have a coherent strategy. And I think that and frankly, there's a huge corruption problem that we don't have. Well, it's true in Afghanistan as much as it is in Africa, but we don't have any models for how you help a society work its way out of really deep endemic corruption, much worse than Ukraine, but deep endemic corruption that in some of these countries makes it really hard to work. But I think your question is a great one, and it's something I hope, you know, to make a major part of what I do for the next few years. My dissertation, ironically, was on Belgian education policy in the Congo, which was a great case study in a bureaucracy hiding from reality. They had a terrific plan to make the Congo independent around 2100. And there was a riot in the summer of '58, and they were gone by '59. And just said, well, that plan didn't work. And it left the Congo as shambles, and it has never recovered. I mean, the Belgians were the most irresponsible of all the colonial powers.
So, it's really funny. I met my roommate when I was moving into my college dorm, and he worked in the Chinese government. And the first conversation we ever had was about the re-education camp, as he calls it, and I called it a concentration camp. But he said very much so that they were for re-education, which is crazy that the youth of China are also being indoctrinated in this way. But my question is about America's declining soft power, as on the same topic of Africa, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative, when we're trying to counter kind of the economic influence China has on countries around the world. America's, I think, running into this dilemma of trying to have our integrity with American values and, you know, trying to uphold democracies, especially with corrupt countries, but also trying to develop them. And so if we pull out, then China obviously fills in, and yet if we stay, we support corrupt governments. And so where do you think that line is on how much we should give, where we should stay, especially when China's a threat?
Well, I think we can stay as long as we're not corrupted by it. But I think there is an enormous advantage in the long run to having a standard of honesty and a standard of legality and insisting on it. And I think, you know, let the Chinese line up 20 or 30 totally corrupt dictatorships and see how long they want to try to sustain it, because they're not going to economically develop. I mean, money doesn't go to places where it can be stolen. Look at Venezuela or Nicaragua. Look at Cuba. So I think we want to say to people, we would love for you to have a chance to have private property. We'd love for you to have the rule of law. We'd love to have a government that's actually honest. And I think we have to think a lot about the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the fact that we still today, in the longest war we fought in our country's history, 18 years, we have no model of operating effectively in a way that would grow a government that wasn't corrupt. And that should really bother us. I think it's a fundamental failure of the American military and the national defense establishment, that after 18 years, they haven't really thought through how hard, and it's hard. None of this stuff's easy. The gentleman,
we have a question in the back.
Mr. Speaker, a few minutes ago you mentioned a few of the ports around the country and terminals around the world that China has taken over either ownership of or leases for. Now, some years ago, here in the United States, everyone got very exercised when Dubai Ports World wanted to take over some of the ports, or actually not ports, but terminals in the United States. But when you look at our hemisphere, China has got terminals on both ends of the now expanded Panama Canal. They are operating broadly in Central America. Now that Russia doesn't have the money to support countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, China is moving into those. They seem to be in our backyard right now, and taking over the transportation infrastructure.
They are. I mean, you know, the two points about that. One, I tried and failed in 2005 to get the government to simply produce weekly, open source, unclassified report on every place on the planet the Chinese were active. So you could go to one website, and we still should do it. I recently been trying to get the Trump administration to do it. But you should be able to literally, frankly, have every embassy just send in clippings. I mean, because the sheer volume of Chinese activity, if you saw it over a period of weeks, would be breathtaking. And again, I think it's a very intelligent approach on their part. Nobody has actually studied the degree to which the Chinese are the dominant dredging companies in the world. I think 80 or 90% of all the dredging in the world now is Chinese. And they increasingly are the dominant managers of ports worldwide. Well, that had to have been a decision in Beijing. And I think if you watch, you'll see them, and this is what they've done with Huawei and 5G. I mean, you're going to see a series of steps to create linkage points that give them the potential in a moment of mobilization to suddenly have assets in places we haven't even dreamed of, and we certainly haven't. There are certainly no, to the best of my knowledge, there is no place in the American government where you could call and say, okay, we actually need to look worldwide at what China's doing and have an accurate report.
Hey, how's it going, Speaker? Matt Purdy, Breitbart News. You'll forgive me if I have a question that is non-China, but being that you ran the 2012 election, I just had a quick question about your reaction to Mitt Romney's.
No, I won't comment here.
Okay, sounds good.
I just want to hear the rest of the question. I don't know where you're okay.
Mr. Speaker, thank you again for being here. It seems like you've illustrated the fact that China has a strategy, a long-term strategy, and we have not established. We're more reactive, maybe not even aware of a lot of what's going on. But do you have any thoughts about how we can extract ourselves from our dependency on China? China produces a vast amount of our pharmaceutical drugs, our drugs, our technology, a lot of our products, and they become very effective in stealing our business models. We were at a Fortune 500 conference in 2005, and Jack sat next to a gentleman from Austria who opened a plant in China, hired a lot of locals. A year later, they opened a plant down the street, took everybody away, put them out of business. And we have a lot of companies saying, wow, we're going into China. This is going to be a great market. And really, they're ripping us off. So we have a lot of dependency on China. Any thoughts about how we...
Sure. I mean, I think if you were designing a grand strategy, and again, I mean, we shouldn't feel bad about ourselves. Between 1946 and 1950, we had a national debate. Now, we happened to have leaders who had fought in World War I, spent 20 years preparing, led World War II. So so these are people who thought on scale. But in a 4-year period or a 5-year period, we designed an entire worldwide strategy, built the alliances to sustain it, invented the CIA, the Strategic Air Command, unified the Defense Department. I mean, spent money covertly in France and Italy to keep them from going communist in the elections in 47. I mean, we did in 48. I mean, we did lots of stuff. And we sustained it, whether it was a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat. I mean, even through Jimmy Carter, who was probably the least engaged, but who gradually got educated and got to be much tougher in the course of his presidency. We sustained it from basically the issuance of NSC 68 in April of 1950 to the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991. And broadly speaking, we never deviated very much. At the margins, whether it was the Vietnam War, the Korean War, et cetera, there were deviations. But the core pattern worldwide was there. I'm confident that once we think it all through and we decide what our goals are and what we want to accomplish, that our capacity to arouse and organize human capabilities is vastly greater than a totalitarian state. Whether even a Chinese totalitarian state. And the specific question you raised is pretty simple. We ought to have a bill in Congress right now to start the debate that says we will allow any company moving its manufacturing out of China to take a tax credit on the total cost of moving it to another country. And overnight, first of all, you would immediately attract the attention of the Chinese. And that's part of it. Part of this is we want to set up positive environments of dialogue in which they understand that we're not fools and that we're not, and that we're not soft people who they can run over and bludgeon. Because the truth is, we're still much bigger than they are. I mean, nominal GDP is very misleading. They got 1,400,000,000 people. They have lots of challenges. They have a huge number of people in poverty. They have big environmental problems. They have big water problems. So I don't think we have to get up every morning and think that it's hopeless, but it's serious, and it's going to take real work.
Can I just jump in here?
Sure. You're in charge.
I am in charge. I'm the only one here who's named president. Right?
That's right.
So the U.S. foreign aid policy tends to be focused on anti-corruption, generally democracy building in some ways. China's foreign aid policy, I don't even know if they think of it as aid, is a projection of economic power.
Right.
Do we need to rethink our anti-corruption, democracy building, do-gooder stance, or do we want to continue to be that country?
I think we want to be, I'm Jeffersonian in the sense that I think there's a huge virtue to us representing the best of the human spirit and saying that remember, what corruption means in the end is that the most powerful rip off the weakest. And what that does in the long run is it sickens the whole society. And I think that there's a virtue to us. And I think we also have to be very, very patient. In 1776, the odds against the number of democracies that currently exist was astonishing. And I think all of the founding fathers had this sense, not that they were going to go out and colonize the planet, but that by being a model and a way of looking and thinking, it's very ironic. Ho Chi Minh read A Life of Washington. Mao read A Life of Washington. I mean, the American model had all sorts of people around the planet looking at it and trying to understand it. And I think that it's good for, I find it fascinating to watch Vietnam, for example, where year by year, they drift further away from Marx and closer to McDonald's.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for being here today. Daryl Smith, I represent an American Legion post here in D.C., and I think I also speak for a lot of other veterans across the country who are increasingly concerned about the Thrift Savings Plan and their recent decision to start investing a large amount of money, upwards of $50 billion, in Chinese companies starting next year. I know you addressed it on the Hill in a magazine in September. I'm curious if it's in your book and if you could address that now.
It is in the book. It's based partly on the work of Roger Robinson, who's a remarkable man who was on the Reagan National Security Staff and helped design the economic campaign that broke Gorbachev. He's very young at the time, and he runs probably the best intelligence operation, small company in Georgetown, the best intelligence operation on Chinese finances and Chinese companies that I've ever encountered. Well, I mean, there are bills being introduced. Marco Rubio in particular has been very good on this. I think we're gradually getting the attention of the Treasury. And I think that it's very likely that these things are, the National Security Council is moving on them. But it's very interesting. I mean, one of the things you have to remember is for the elites at the level of the sort of the New York money manager types, China has been wonderful. These people made billions. I mean, there's a reason that Bloomberg gave a recent interview in which he said China really wasn't a dictatorship. It really had to take, really had to please its people. I mean, you read this article and it's like insane. But if you're Bloomberg, and the Chinese at one point threatened to kick out all of his businesses because they'd actually begun running a series in Bloomberg News on corruption in China. And Bloomberg caved. I mean, because the Chinese said, we're going to rip out every single one of your devices. And they said, oh, okay, we got it. It's not, we're not giving up that much money just to be good journalists. And so I think that there are a number of people who are billionaires because of China. And from their perspective, this is all just, it's just money. And how can you worry about little things like the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or people being disappeared?
All right, just for the record, I used to work for Bloomberg. The journalists, many of those journalists quit the company because of that.
No.
And it was the business side. So I'm just, before.
Oh no, I didn't suggest it was the journalist.
Okay.
I mean, the person who told me this. The person who told me the story.
My profession this evening.
Well, no, the person who told me the story was one of the journalists who quit.
Okay. We have another question over here.
By the way, I should say, just to be defensive for half a second, that I wrote my first article for a weekly newspaper when I was, I think, 11. That I had a mentor in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, named Paul Walker, who ran the Harrisburg Home Star. I cut my teeth on politics by reading Frank Kent of the Baltimore Sun, and I think that the best of American journalism is world class.
Okay, thank you.
I would like more of it. Go ahead.
Thank you for sharing your views. It's very interesting. I wanted to ask you, recently we held the annual meetings of the World Bank International Monetary Fund here in town. What are your views on multilateralism and the roles of these institutions?
I'm very much for functional multilateralism because, for example, the International Postal Union. It's because it's practical and it works and it makes things, the way in which we manage air traffic control worldwide. I mean, so I'm very much opposed to political multilateralism. I do think that sovereignty is I'm against globalism per se because I think it represents a nonsense concept. I mean, there's no natural base for a globalist system.
Okay, I'm just going to cut here because we are out of time for questions. I know everyone has more questions, but the speaker is going to sign some of his books over there. You'll all have a few moments with him. Before we finish, I want to present to you one of the most highly coveted items ever available in Washington, D.C., a National Press Club coffee or whatever you want to drink mug.
I want all of you to notice, I'm going to put this side so you can see it.